portable lab tent shuddered in the Peruvian wind as Dr. Nolan Thorne stared at the DNA results, his face drained of color. The skeleton they'd unearthed from beneath the ancient ruins was 12,000 years old. The genetic match was perfect. It was him. "Run it again," Nolan demanded, his voice tight. Bradley Ashworth, our geneticist, didn't look up from his equipment. "I've run it 4 times. Every single marker matches. Mitochondrial DNA, autosomal markers, even the rare mutations. This person buried 12,000 years ago is genetically identical to you." We were 60 kilometers northeast of Nazca, in a valley the locals called Quebrada del Silencio, the Gorge of Silence. For 3 years, the Peruvian government kept this site classified. Only when NASA's astrobiology division detected geometric formations beneath the bedrock did they finally grant access. The satellite imaging showed structures too precise, too deliberate to be natural. The indigenous Quechua villagers refused to speak of this place. When I'd asked an elderly shopkeeper about the valley, he'd simply closed his door mid-afternoon, drawing his curtains against the dying light. Now I understood his fear. Nolan was the most rational man I'd ever known in my 6 years at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He could face impossible data and extract meaning from chaos, but there was no chaos here. Just his own genetic code, staring back from bones buried before civilization began. "Contamination," I offered weakly. "The sample was pristine, Garrett," Bradley said, exhaustion bleeding into his words. 17 different genetic markers. The degradation patterns are consistent with carbon dating. Whoever this was died in this exact location 12,000 years ago, and they were genetically you, Nolan." The wind picked up, whistling through the canvas walls. Sound traveled wrong in this valley. Echoes arrived before the noises that caused them, as if time itself had bent around this place. Nolan set down the printout with deliberate care. When he spoke, his voice carried that careful flatness people use when fighting to stay rational. "Simon, take a team into Chamber 7. Full skeletal inventory before sunset." I nodded, already reaching for my headlamp. What none of us knew then, what I desperately wish we'd never discovered, was that Nolan's skeleton wasn't alone. The deeper chambers held hundreds more, and every single one matched a living person somewhere on Earth, including me. The descent into Chamber 7 required 3 ladder sections bolted into crumbling limestone. My headlamp carved a narrow cone through darkness that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Behind me, Theo Langford's careful breathing echoed. Below, Dennis Croft's footsteps scraped against stone. Dennis reached the chamber floor first. His light swept across the space, and he made a sound between a laugh and a sob. "Oh, hell." When my boots hit packed earth, I understood his reaction. The chamber was massive, roughly 40 meters at its widest point, with a ceiling arching into shadow. But it wasn't the size that stopped me cold. It was the bones. Skeletons lined the walls in alcoves carved with geometric precision. Each positioned identically, knees drawn to chest, arms wrapped around shins, skulls tilted slightly upward as if watching something on the ceiling we couldn't see. I stopped counting at 60. There were easily twice that many, extending into passages branching in 3 directions. "This is a burial chamber," Theo said softly, his usual nervous energy replaced by perfect stillness. "Pre-Columbian, definitely. But the architectural style, it's not Nazca, not Inca, not anything I've ever seen." I approached the nearest alcove. The skeleton was remarkably preserved, bones connected by desiccated ligaments hardened over millennia. The skull was proportioned like a modern human's, teeth worn but intact. As we documented the chamber, I noticed the walls between alcoves. The geometric patterns weren't decorative. They were too regular, too deliberate, mathematical. like someone had encoded information into the stone itself. "Garrett, you need to see this." Theo's voice came from one of the branching passages. I followed Theo's voice through a low archway into a narrower corridor. He stood before a wall section where the carvings had changed. Not geometric patterns anymore. These were images, pictographs telling a story. My light joined his, illuminating the first panel. Figures falling from the sky. Not flying, falling. Bodies contorted, limbs splayed, plummeting toward a curved surface that could only be Earth. Behind them hung something massive in the darkness. A shape I couldn't quite pass, all angles and impossible dimensions. The second panel showed impact. Bodies scattered across a landscape I recognized, the distinctive lines of the Nazca Plateau, mountains rising in the distance. The figures were broken, dying, but some were standing, surviving. The third panel showed them building, digging into the earth, carrying their dead into chambers exactly like the one we stood in. "What does this look like to you?" I asked quietly. Theo was silent before answering, a tremor at the edges of his voice. "It looks like a record of arrival, of colonization, maybe, but from above, not across an ocean." He paused. "The dating on these carvings would be contemporary with the skeletons, 12,000 years minimum, before any known civilization in the Americas, before the pyramids, before Sumeria, before we were supposed to be here at all." I photographed the panels, taking multiple angles, but one detail in the third panel held me, a smaller image almost hidden among the figures. A date, not in any calendar system I recognized, but clearly a date, marks arranged in a counting pattern. And next to it, another image of Earth. But in this one, the planet was cracked. Something dark was emerging from the fractures, spreading across the surface like roots growing in time-lapse. My radio crackled. "Simon, we've got results from the secondary DNA batch." Nolan's voice was tight with static. "You need to come topside." The climb back felt longer than the descent. Each ladder rung seemed to stretch the distance, darkness below pulling at me like physical weight. When I reached the surface, Nolan's expression told me the news was worse than I'd imagined. He'd spread printouts across the folding table like evidence at a trial. 7 sheets, each showing a perfect match between an ancient skeleton and a living person. We pulled samples from 12 remains in the upper alcoves. Bradley said, standing at the tent's edge, looking like he hadn't slept in days. 7 came back with matches in global databases, immigration records, medical files, criminal justice systems. The other 5 are still processing. I picked up the nearest printout. Douglas Vance, 41, Omaha, Nebraska, construction foreman, 2 kids. The skeleton matching his DNA had been dead for approximately 11,000 years. "Have we contacted any of them?" I asked. "That's above our clearance. Houston is handling notifications." Nolan paused, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Fear, maybe, or resignation. "Simon, they found your match." I'd known it was coming. I'd felt it since I first descended into that chamber, but hearing it confirmed was different. "Where?" "Passage C, about 40 meters in. Skeletal preservation is exceptional. They're estimating 12,300 years, give or take a century." He slid another printout towards me. "Every marker, Simon. Mitochondrial, autosomal, Y chromosome. It's you." I stared at the paper, numbers and letters blurring into meaningless noise. Somewhere in those tunnels, buried in an alcove carved before the last ice age ended, was a body sharing my exact genetic code. Not an ancestor, not a relative. Me. The next 3 hours passed in a fugue state. I organized equipment, reviewed Theo's spatial maps, coordinated with the security team from Lima. But my mind kept circling back to Passage C, 40 meters in. My own bones waiting in the dark. Dennis finally pulled me out of it, appearing at my elbow while I pretended to study a topographical chart. "You should see it," he said quietly. "Your skeleton. I think you should see it." "Why?" "Because there's something wrong with it. Something the DNA analysis didn't catch." I followed Dennis across the excavation site, past the generator's constant mechanical prayer, past armed guards trained to show nothing. The entrance to the main shaft was marked with orange tape and portable floodlights that turned ancient stone the color of dried blood. Dennis led me through Chamber 7, past rows of watching skulls, into Passage C. The tunnel narrowed as we went deeper, walls pressing closer. The carvings grew more elaborate with each meter. I saw geometric shapes that seemed to move in my peripheral vision, figures that might have been human, or something else entirely. The air grew colder, carrying a scent like old copper, and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic that reminded me absurdly of how a hospital smells beneath the antiseptic. "Temperature's dropping," Dennis observed, his breath misting. "We're at least 100 meters below surface. The geology doesn't make sense. This limestone layer shouldn't extend this deep. Nothing about this place makes sense. Fair point. Here." He stopped before an alcove identical to all the others. Same carved frame, same positioning. The preservation was even better here. I could see desiccated tissue still clinging to bones, dark and leathery with age. But when his flashlight beam fell across the skeleton, I understood what he meant. The bones were arranged in standard posture, knees to chest, arms wrapped around shins. But the skull faced the wall instead of the chamber, and carved into the stone directly in front of it, positioned so the empty eye sockets would have been staring at it, was a message. In English. "Simon, forgive yourself. It wasn't your fault. The loop closes whether we fight it or not. But you have to try. You have to be the one who breaks it. I'm sorry I couldn't. I'm sorry for everything that comes next. When you find the deep chamber, remember, the door opens both ways. I read it 3 times. 4. The letters were carved with the same ancient precision as everything else, the same weathering, the same 12,000-year patina. My hand drifted up to touch the stone. The surface was cold beneath my fingertips, cold and smooth and undeniably real. "That's your handwriting?" Dennis said. "I've seen your field notes, the way you make capital letters, the slant of your script. That's you." He was right. I recognized it too. The slight rightward lean. The way I connected certain letters out of habit. The specific flourish on my capital S that my 3rd grade teacher had tried unsuccessfully to correct. I had written those words. Somehow, impossibly, I'd carved them into this stone millennia before I was born. "What loop?" I whispered. "What door?" Dennis shook his head. "I don't know, but there's more. When I was photographing the deeper sections, I found another chamber. It's not on any of our maps. The passage to it is hidden behind a carved panel in the eastern corridor. I almost missed it. The seam's nearly invisible unless light hits it at exactly the right angle." "Did you report it?" "Not yet." He met my eyes. I saw the same desperate need to understand that was clawing at my own chest. "I wanted you to see it first. Whatever's down there, I think it's meant for you. The message says you have to be the one. We should have gone back. Should have reported the hidden chamber, followed protocol. Every training I'd received screamed we were making a mistake. I could already hear Nolan's disappointment. But the message had been addressed to me, carved by my own hand before I existed. And somewhere in the depths of this ancient place, something was waiting, something that knew my name. Dennis led the way through the eastern corridor to the carved panel he'd discovered. It looked like part of the wall at first glance. But when he pressed a specific point, the stone shifted inward with a grinding echo. Behind it was darkness. Not normal darkness, something thicker, something that seemed to push back against our lights. "You feel that?" Dennis asked. I did. A vibration in the air, too low to hear, but strong enough to register in my bones. Like standing next to a massive engine, except there was nothing here but stone and silence. "The deep chamber," I said. "That's what the message meant." The passage beyond sloped downward at a steep angle. The carvings on the walls changed as we descended, less geometric, more organic. Shapes that looked like neural networks, like root systems, like branching blood vessels feeding something vast. Then, without warning, the passage opened into empty space. Our flashlights couldn't find the walls, couldn't find the ceiling, couldn't find anything except the floor beneath our feet. And in the distance, a faint light that shouldn't have existed this far underground. The scale of the space defied comprehension. My mind kept trying to calculate dimensions and failing, as if darkness itself refused to provide information. The light was soft, almost organic, with a quality like bioluminescence. It outlined a shape against the void. As my eyes adjusted, the shape resolved into something impossible. Dennis grabbed my arm, fingers digging hard enough to bruise. "Garrett, is that a ship?" It was a ship. No other word fit. The craft rested on the cavern floor like a cathedral that had fallen from the sky and forgotten how to break. Its hull was dark, metallic grey, seamless, no visible rivets or welds or joints indicating human construction. The dimensions defied measurement. I guessed 200 meters at its longest axis, maybe 60 at the widest. But the proportions seemed to shift when I looked directly at them, as if the ship existed in slightly more dimensions than my eyes could process. The light we'd seen was emanating from symbols along its surface. Not painted, not projected. The hull itself was producing the glow, soft pulses traveling in waves from stern to bow like a slow heartbeat. 12,000 years. Dennis breathed. "This thing's been down here for 12,000 years, and it's still running." We approached slowly, footsteps echoing in the vast space. The floor beneath us was smooth stone, carved with the same geometric patterns from throughout the ruins. But here they converged, flowing toward the ship like rivers feeding an ocean. Everything in this place had been built to point at this vessel. Near the ship, the air was different, warmer, with a faint electrical taste like copper settling on my tongue. I found myself breathing shallowly, as if too much oxygen might disturb whatever ancient processes kept this craft alive. "There," I said, indicating a section of hull near what I assumed was the front. An opening, roughly rectangular, darker than the surrounding metal. "A door." "Garrett, maybe we should—" The message said I have to be the one. I heard the words leave my mouth, barely recognizing my own voice. There was certainty in it that didn't belong to me. "The door opens both ways. Whatever that means, I think the answer's inside." The hull had an unexpected texture up close, almost organic, like ancient tree bark smoothed by millennia of wind. The symbols continued to pulse, and I felt vibration passing through the air, through my bones, through something deeper than bones. As we stepped through the threshold, lights flickered to life along the corridor walls, the same soft luminescence as the exterior symbols. Warm, almost welcoming. The first chamber we found was small, roughly circular, with curved benches lining the walls, seats designed for human bodies. The proportions were perfect. The height, the depth, the spacing. This ship had been built for people like us. "Garrett," Dennis had stopped at the far end where another corridor branched off. "There's writing here, same as the message on your skeleton. I joined him. The words were carved into the wall in English letters rendered with ancient precision. If you're reading this, the loop is still intact. We came back to warn ourselves, but the warning always comes too late. Earth dies in 2031. Something wakes beneath the crust. We tried running forward, centuries, millennia, but it spreads, consumes everything, so we ran backward instead. Built the archive, buried our dead so you would find them and understand. You are us. We are you. Every person alive in your time is descended from survivors who fled backward. Your entire civilization exists because we created it, seeding the past with our genetics, our knowledge, our desperate hope that one iteration of humanity might find a way to stop what's coming. This is the 17th loop. In every previous cycle, the one who finds this message fails. The catastrophe happens. The survivors flee backward. The loop begins again. But you, Simon, you're different. In your timeline, geological surveys show the awakening happening earlier than predicted. You have less time, but more warning. The door at the center of the ship can send you forward to the moment before emergence. You can see what we're running from, and maybe, finally, you can stop it. Or you can do what every other version of you has done. Refuse. Seal the chamber. Bury the truth. Let humanity forget until the next cycle. The loop closes either way. The choice is yours. It always has been. I read it twice, 3 times. Each repetition carved the words deeper into my understanding. 17 loops, 17 iterations of human civilization, each ending in the same catastrophe, each sending survivors backward to become ancestors of the next attempt. This is insane, Dennis breathed. Is it? I stared at the words. The DNA matches, the carbon dating, the pictographs showing people falling from the sky. It all fits. Fitting a narrative doesn't make it true. Then explain the ship, Dennis. Explain lights functioning after 12 millennia. Explain my own handwriting on a skeleton that died before agriculture was invented. He didn't have an answer. Neither did I. But the message mentioned a door at the center of the ship, and I knew with borrowed certainty that I was going to find it. We moved deeper into the vessel. More chambers, more corridors, more evidence of human habitation. Storage compartments, what might have been sleeping quarters, a larger space that could have served as a common area. Everything preserved, everything waiting. Dust covered some surfaces, but there was no decay. The ship existed outside normal time, or at least outside normal entropy. In one smaller chamber, I found personal effects scattered on a shelf. A worn leather journal, its pages blank. A tarnished metal ring sized for a man's finger. A small carved figure that might have been a child's toy, worn smooth by handling. These were remnants of lives lived, of people who had boarded this vessel knowing they would never see their own time again. I thought about the skeletons in the alcoves above. Hundreds of men and women who had fled backward through history to become our ancestors. How many had stood in this same corridor, touched these same objects, faced the same impossible choice I was about to confront. Then we found the door. It stood at the center of a spherical chamber, a perfect circle of darkness set into a frame of the same organic metal as the hull. The frame was covered in symbols I didn't recognize. Not the geometric patterns from the walls, but something more complex, more intentional. They shifted as I watched, rearranging themselves in sequences that almost resembled language. The door opens both ways, I murmured, forward and backward. They used it to flee into the past, but it can also go forward. To 2031. Dennis said. To whatever's coming. The air felt different here, heavier, charged with potential like the moment before lightning strikes. The door's darkness wasn't simply absence of light, it was something else. Something that pulled at my attention, my thoughts, my sense of where and when I was. "We should tell the others," Dennis said. "Nolan, Bradley, the whole team. This changes everything." "And what will they do?" "File reports, hold committee meetings, debate implications while whatever's sleeping under Earth's crust gets closer to waking." "What's the alternative? You jump through some ancient portal alone and hope you can somehow stop a planetary catastrophe?" I didn't answer. I was watching the symbols on the frame cycle through their patterns. One sequence kept repeating, and as I stared, I realized I could almost read it. Not the individual characters, but the meaning behind them. A warning, a welcome, an invitation. The message said every other version of me failed. I said quietly, 17 loops, 17 failures. Maybe the 18th time is different. Or maybe the 18th time is exactly the same, and you're just another Simon Garrett convincing himself he's special. The words stung because they were probably true. I had no reason to believe I was different from my predecessors. No special knowledge, no unique abilities. Just the same desperation and the same impossible choice. But I also had something they didn't. I had the message from my own skeleton telling me to forgive myself, telling me it wasn't my fault, which meant that in at least one previous loop I had tried. I had gone through that door, faced whatever was coming, and failed. And the version of me who came back to die in this chamber had wanted me to know that failure wasn't the end, that trying mattered even when it didn't succeed. "I have to see it," I said. "Whatever's under the earth, I have to understand what we're running from." "Garrett, you don't have to come. Go back. Tell the others. Do whatever you think is right. But I can't walk away from this. Not when every person alive is apparently descended from survivors who fled backward through time to escape something so terrible they chose to restart civilization from scratch rather than face it." Dennis was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. "Damn it!" He shook his head, resignation settling over his features. "I'm not letting you go alone. If you're going to do something monumentally stupid, someone should be there to document it." Despite everything, I felt a flicker of gratitude. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. We don't even know if that thing works." I turned back to the door. The symbols were still cycling, but slower now, as if the ancient mechanism was waiting. Listening. The darkness at its center seemed to deepen, and I could have sworn I felt something looking back at me from the other side. "Only one way to find out," I said, and I stepped forward. The transition wasn't violent. I'd expected pain, disorientation, the sensation of being torn apart. Instead, there was simply a moment of absolute stillness, a pause between heartbeats that stretched into something infinite. And then I was somewhere else. Someone else. What I found in 2031 would change everything. What I discovered about the so-called catastrophe would reveal the true nature of the loop. And what I chose to do about it, the sacrifice I would make, would finally, after 17 failed iterations, break the cycle that had trapped humanity since before history began. But that choice, and the price it demanded, would cost me everything I was. The loop was ending. One way or another, the 18th iteration would be the last.